There's a coffee can sitting on a folding table in rural Ohio, and by 6 o'clock tonight, it's going to have paid for half a ton of meat. Nobody's watching it, nobody's counting it while people walk by, and somehow, for going on 60 years, it's never once come up short enough to shut the whole thing down. Every Saturday before dawn, a man named Eli walks out to a pit dug into the clay behind his barn and lights a fire that will burn for the next 14 hours. There's no gas line running to it, no electricity anywhere on the property, no walk-in freezer humming in the back. By the time that fire's out, one family, working with hand tools and a system passed down through 4 generations, will have fed close to 400 people. By noon, folding tables will stretch the length of 2 football fields. By evening, the smoke from that single pit will have cooked through more than half a ton of meat, and every plate will be paid for on the honor system, that same coffee can by the gate, where people drop in whatever they can afford and nobody ever checks. So how does one Amish family with no refrigeration truck, no staff on payroll and no register anywhere in sight pull off a barbecue that outfeeds most restaurants in the county every single week without ever running short? To understand that, you have to start where the day actually starts, not at the pit. At 3:45 in the morning, in the dark, in the barn. Eli Yoder is 34 years old, and he's been building fires since he was 7. His father did the same route Eli walks now, and his father's father before him, back when the town cookout was a dozen families and a single hog, instead of the operation it's become. Eli doesn't call it a business. He calls it the Saturday thing, the way you'd describe a chore that happens to feed a town. The morning starts with the animals, because on a working farm, the barbecue doesn't get special treatment ahead of the cows. Milking comes first. Eli and his 2 oldest sons, ages 12 and 10, move through the barn by lantern light. And by the time the sun is even thinking about coming up, 31 dairy cows have been milked, fed, and turned back out to pasture. This part never changes. Holiday, off-season, blizzard. The farm doesn't know it's supposed to be a special day. It's only after the barn work is done that the family turns to the pit. The pit itself is nothing fancy to look at. It's a trench about 18 feet long and 3 feet deep, lined with fieldstone the family gathered from their own back 40 over the course of 2 summers. There's no thermometer built into it, no digital readout. Eli reads the fire the way his grandfather taught him to, by the color of the coals and the way smoke curls off the top. He says a fire that's ready looks almost lazy. Grey ash with a dull orange heartbeat underneath. Nothing sharp or bright. Bright means it's still too hot to cook on, and meat set over bright coals just seizes up and burns on the outside before it's done anywhere else. Getting the fire to that lazy, patient stage takes close to 2 hours. And it has to happen before a single piece of meat goes anywhere near the pit, because once the cooking starts, there's no oven dial to turn down if something goes wrong. The wood itself matters as much as the timing. Eli burns almost exclusively hickory, split the previous winter and stacked under a lean-to behind the barn, so it has a full year to dry out before it ever touches the pit. Greenwood, he says, throws too much smoke and not enough heat, and it leaves a bitter edge on the meat that no amount of sauce can cover up. By his estimate, the family burns close to 4 full cords of hickory over the course of a single summer, all of it split by hand, mostly by Eli and his sons, on the evenings when the farm work lets up early enough. The meat itself arrives the night before, delivered by a neighboring farmer who raises hogs specifically for this one family's Saturdays, plus a second load of chicken quarters from a poultry operation 2 farms over. Between the two, the family is working with roughly 1,100 pounds of raw product before the day even begins. All of it kept in a spring house built over a natural cold spring on the property, the same cooling trick the family has used since before rural electricity ever reached this stretch of road. No compressor, no fan, just cold water running under the floorboards, keeping the meat at a safe temperature through the night. Eli checks it twice before bed and once more before the fire's even lit, running his hand along the crocks the way you'd check a sleeping kid one last time before turning in. By 6 in the morning, Eli's wife, Rachel, and her sisters have taken over the kitchen end of the operation. And this is where the meal actually gets its character, because the meat is really just the anchor. The sides are what make 400 people show up week after week instead of driving into town for something faster. Rachel runs the sauce, a recipe she keeps mostly in her head, built off apple cider vinegar, brown sugar, and a blend of spices she buys in bulk from a Mennonite dry goods store 40 minutes away. She and her sisters will make close to 18 gallons of it before the morning is over, split between a vinegar-forward batch for the pork and a thicker, sweeter batch for the chicken. At the same time, 4 more women are working through what the family calls the cellar list, coleslaw made from cabbage the family grew themselves and stored through the winter, baked beans simmered for hours in a cast-iron pot big enough to bathe a toddler in, and dinner rolls, close to 900 of them, proofed and baked in batches on a wood-fired oven built into the side of the summer kitchen. Nobody in that kitchen is getting paid by the hour. Nobody clocks in. It's aunts, cousins and daughters working a system that's been refined so many times over the years that almost nobody has to ask what to do next. The bread oven alone is its own small operation. It only holds 24 rolls per bake, which means the family runs close to 40 batches back to back over the course of the morning, someone feeding the firebox underneath while someone else pulls trays and slides in the next round. There's no proofing box with a temperature dial either. The dough rises in wooden troughs set near the oven's residual heat, and the women judge it ready the same way Eli judges his coals, by feel and by eye, a slight give under a floured knuckle. It's the kind of skill that doesn't show up on a resume anywhere, but it's the reason 900 rolls come out consistent, week after week, without a single batch getting tossed. Here's where the scale of this starts to actually land. Most backyard cooks think of barbecue in terms of a single brisket or a rack of ribs, something that feeds a dozen people on a good day. This family is running 1,100 pounds of raw meat, 18 gallons of sauce and 900 rolls through a kitchen with no refrigerated prep tables, no industrial mixers and no walk-in cooler, using labor that shows up because it's family, not because it's a job. Back at the pit, Eli and his sons load the meat in stages, starting with the pork shoulders because they take the longest, 6 to 8 hours over indirect heat before they're ready to pull. The chicken goes on later, timed so it finishes closer to serving without drying out. Managing that timing across 1,100 pounds of meat, with no dial to check and no way to speed things up if the fire dips, is really the whole skill of the job. Eli says his father used to test doneness the same way people have for 200 years, pressing a finger into the meat and reading the resistance. And Eli does the same thing now with his own hands, no meat thermometer in sight. Around 10 in the morning, the tables start going up. This is where the town itself becomes part of the machine. Neighbors who aren't Amish, families from 3 different church congregations, and a handful of retired men who show up every week specifically to set tables, all arrive with folding chairs and sawhorses and start assembling the seating without needing much direction. Nobody's being paid to do this either. It's simply understood that if you're going to eat, You help build the place you're going to eat in. There's a rhythm to the setup that outsiders don't notice at first. The tables always go up in the same order, closest to the pit first, so the food never has to travel far while it's still hot. The same 3 families always claim the same stretch of shade under the same maple trees, not because anyone assigned it, but because that's simply where their grandparents sat, and their grandparents before that. A woman named Sarah, who isn't related to the Yodas at all, has brought her own pickled beets to set out on the table for 11 straight summers, and nobody has ever asked her to. She just started doing it, and now people would notice if she stopped. By 11:30, the smell of the pit has drifted far enough that people start arriving even before the food is technically ready. And this is the moment that captures what actually makes this different from a normal cookout. There's no menu board, no register, no line of workers taking orders. There's a stack of paper plates at one end of the first table and a coffee can at the other. And in between, whatever a family can afford goes into that can. A 5, a 10, sometimes just loose change from a kid's pocket. And nobody checks, nobody counts it while people are watching, and nobody is ever turned away from the line because the can looks light. That detail alone is worth sitting with. A family running an operation with over $1,000 of raw ingredients on any given Saturday is trusting an entire town, several hundred strangers and neighbors alike, to pay what they can on their own with zero enforcement. And somehow, week after week, for going on 9 years now, it's worked. Ellie says some weeks the can comes up short of what the ingredients cost, and some weeks it comes up well over. And over the course of a year, it evens out enough that the family keeps doing it. He doesn't run it like a business because he's never once treated it like one. By noon, the first pork shoulders come off the pit, and this is the payoff the whole morning has been building toward. Close to 14 hours of fire management, 3 generations of labour, and a kitchen full of women who started before sunrise, all converging into a folding table that stretches the length of 2 football fields, loaded with meat, pulled apart by hand, coleslaw made from cabbage the family grew, and rolls baked in a wood oven that morning. If you want to see how a whole operation like this actually comes together, from the way an Amish family plans out an entire farming and community calendar, to the smaller traditions that don't make it into a video like this one, I put a lot of that into something called the Amish Almanac. It's not a cookbook exactly, more a look at how families like the Yodas structure a full year around the land and the church and days like this one. The link's in the description if you want to check it out, and there's also a QR code up on screen right now if you'd rather just scan it. Alright, back to the pit. What happens over the next 4 hours is less about cooking and more about logistics. Eli's 12-year-old, the same boy who was milking cows at 4 in the morning, spends his afternoon running fresh loads of pulled pork from the pit to the serving tables in a wheelbarrow lined with butcher paper, back and forth, probably a dozen trips before the day winds down. His younger brother handles the chicken the same way. Nobody assigned them these jobs in any formal sense. It's simply what the boys in this family have always done at this age, the same way Eli did it for his father, and the way his father did it before him. By 1 in the afternoon, the crowd has thickened into what looks less like a barbecue and more like a town gathering that happens to have really good food at the center of it. Cars line the gravel shoulder of the road for close to a quarter mile in both directions, parked next to a row of buggies the Amish families arrived in. Horses tied off in the shade with buckets of water someone always remembers to fill. There's no traffic director, no sign telling anyone where to park. People just find a spot and walk the rest of the way in, drawn by the smoke as much as anything else. Old men who've been coming since the operation was a fraction of its current size sit at the same tables they always sit at. Kids from 3 different school districts run between the tables while their parents catch up on a week's worth of news they didn't have time to swap over the phone. Because most of these families don't really use phones the way the rest of the country does. For a lot of the non-Amish families in that crowd, this Saturday cookout has become the one weekly event where the whole community, buggy families and car families alike, actually sits down together. Here's the part that tends to surprise people who assume Amish life runs on rigid separation from the wider world. This barbecue isn't a closed event. It isn't just for the Amish. English neighbours, the term the family uses for anyone outside the Amish community, are not just welcome, they're the majority of the crowd most weeks. Eli says his grandfather started the tradition originally as a small thank you to English neighbours who helped rebuild a barn after a fire back in the 60s, and it just never stopped. 60 years later, it's still running on that same instinct. Feed the people around you, whoever they are, and let the town take care of itself. By 3 in the afternoon, the meat is nearly gone, and this is usually the point where Eli starts scraping down the pit, pulling out the spent coals, and thinking about the next fire he'll need to build in exactly 7 days. There's no off-season for this operation. Winter cuts the crowd down some, but the family still runs it every Saturday, just with a smaller pit and a shorter table, because stopping entirely was never really on the table. Rachel says the one year they considered skipping a week, during a particularly brutal February, they had a dozen neighbours show up anyway, assuming the fire would be lit regardless of the weather. What's easy to miss watching all of this from the outside is just how little of it depends on anything modern. No point-of-sale system, no walk-in freezer, no paid staff, no scheduling software, no social media marketing pulling people in. Word of mouth and a fire that's been burning in some form for 60 years is the entire operation. And it isn't cheap labor exploiting a family either. Nobody in that kitchen or at those tables is being coerced into anything. It's simply what the culture expects of itself. That if you have land and animals and hands willing to work before sunrise, you use all 3 to feed the people around you. By 5 in the evening, the tables start coming down the same way they went up. Neighbours folding chairs and stacking sawhorses without being asked. The coffee can gets carried back to the house, and Eli walks the length of the now empty field one more time, checking for anything left behind. 6 days from now, before the sun is even close to up, he'll be back in that same barn milking the same 31 cows, and somewhere in the middle of that ordinary Friday, he'll start thinking about the fire again. It's worth asking what actually makes something like this last for 60 years, when so many small community traditions quietly die out after a decade or two. It isn't the meat, honestly, and it isn't even really the fire. It's the fact that nobody in that family has ever once stopped to calculate whether it's worth it. Whether the 1,100 pounds of meat and the 18 gallons of sauce and the 900 rolls actually pencil out against whatever ends up in that coffee can. The math was never the point. The town showing up, week after week, generation after generation, was always the actual return. And maybe that's the real question worth sitting with here. In a world where almost everything gets measured against its cost, what would it take for you to keep doing something like this anyway? Fire after fire, year after year, just because the people around you are worth feeding.